The morning fog rolled thick and low over the Monongahela River, the way it always did in late October, wrapping Pittsburgh's South Shore in a gray wool blanket that smelled of iron and old rain. Raymond Ellsworth stood at the kitchen window of his narrow row house on Bingham Street, watching the mist swallow the far bank whole, the way time had swallowed everything else he'd once known. He was 74 years old and built like a man who had spent his life arguing with heavy machinery, broad through the shoulders, thick in the hands, with knuckles that carried the permanent discoloration of decades spent in engine rooms and on factory floors. His white hair was cut close and neat, his jaw always freshly shaved, because Raymond Ellsworth believed that a man who stopped taking care of himself had already started dying. His daughter had told him that was an old-fashioned thing to think. He had told her that most true things were old-fashioned. The coffee maker gurgled behind him. He didn't turn around. On the small kitchen table, beneath the hanging light that his late wife Dorothy had picked out at a hardware store in 1987, and that he had never once considered replacing, sat a drafting notebook, the old kind, with graph paper pages and a hard green cover. It was open to a page dense with calculations, cross-sections, and hand-drawn schematics, pressure ratings, valve tolerances, heat exchange ratios. The handwriting was precise and architectural, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a generation that had learned to write as if permanence mattered. Raymond had been working on those pages for 11 months. He poured his coffee, black, no sugar, and sat down across from the notebook without picking it up. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has built with his own hands, with the complicated mixture of pride and uncertainty that creation always brings. Then he picked up the phone. It rang 4 times before she answered. "Grandpa." Chloe's voice carried the particular texture of someone who had been awake for a while but hadn't yet fully committed to the day. "It's 6:45 in the morning." "I know what time it is," Raymond said. "I need you to look at something. Can you come by this weekend?" A pause. He heard her shift in whatever she was sitting in. Her desk chair, probably, because Chloe Ellsworth was constitutionally incapable of working anywhere other than her desk. "What kind of something?" "Engineering something." Another pause, longer this time. "Grandpa, we talked about this." "No," he said, not unkindly. "You talked. I listened, and I need you to look at what I've been working on and tell me if I'm wrong. That's all. Just tell me if I'm wrong." Chloe Ellsworth was 26 years old, 2 years out of Carnegie Mellon's College of Engineering, and currently working as a junior mechanical engineer at a consulting firm in downtown Pittsburgh. She was Raymond's only grandchild, the daughter of his son David, who had moved to Phoenix 15 years ago and called on birthdays and Christmas and whenever he needed to feel like a decent son without doing the actual work of being one. Chloe had stayed. She had chosen Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon and a firm that paid her $62,000 a year, partly because she loved the city and partly, Raymond suspected, because she felt the pull of proximity to him, a pull she would never name out loud because naming it would have felt to her like weakness. She had her grandmother's eyes, dark brown, almost black in certain light, with a directness to them that made people feel simultaneously seen and slightly off balance. She had Raymond's jaw, stubborn, set, and her mother's height, which meant she stood 5'10" in flat shoes and had spent most of her adolescence learning not to apologize for it. "Saturday," she said finally. "I'll come Saturday morning, but I'm bringing donuts and I'm allowed to tell you if something doesn't work. That's all I'm asking." He hung up and looked at the notebook again. The core of what Raymond had drawn across those dense and careful pages was not magic. It was not a fantasy. It was thermodynamics, the oldest, most honest branch of engineering, the one that couldn't be argued with or disrupted or reimagined by someone with a venture capital check and a TED Talk. Steam rose, pressure built, turbines turned, electricity was generated. These were facts as permanent as gravity, and Raymond Ellsworth had spent 51 years of his professional life understanding them at a depth that most modern engineers, trained on simulation software and systems modeling, had never been required to reach. What he had drawn was a hybrid steam turbine system, a closed-loop, high-efficiency configuration that married 19th-century thermodynamic principles with modern materials science and computer-assisted pressure management. The kind of system that could, in theory, power a mid-sized industrial facility for a fraction of the operating cost of conventional electrical supply. Using biomass fuel sources that rural Ohio had in abundance, wood pellets, agricultural waste, municipal solid organic material. The kind of system that nobody in the energy industry was currently building because the energy industry had decided that steam was dead. Raymond Ellsworth did not believe that steam was dead. He believed that steam had been abandoned by people who had stopped paying attention. He had retired 8 years ago from Consolidated Steel Partners, a Pittsburgh firm that had survived the decimation of the American steel industry by pivoting to specialty metals and industrial maintenance contracts. Raymond had spent his last 12 years there as their chief mechanical engineer, managing the maintenance and efficiency optimization of aging industrial systems across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. He had been good at it, better than good. He had a particular gift for understanding the behavior of systems that were under stress. The way pressure distributes unequally through imperfect pipes, the way thermal expansion warps tolerances over years of cycling, the way a machine telegraphs its failures through vibration and sound long before any sensor catches them. He had saved Consolidated millions of dollars over the years. He had also made enemies of the younger engineers who found his methods too empirical, or too instinctual, not sufficiently data-driven. There had been a particular incident in 2013 involving a turbine failure at a plant in Youngstown, Ohio, where Raymond had diagnosed the problem by ear, literally by pressing his palm to the housing and listening, while 3 engineers with laptops ran diagnostic software that pointed them in the wrong direction. When he was proven right, it had been received not with gratitude but with the particular resentment that competence generates in people who feel threatened by it. He had retired with a modest pension, his notebook collection, Dorothy's Kitchen Light, and the unfinished business of an idea he hadn't yet had time to fully develop. Dorothy had died 14 months ago. Congestive heart failure, quiet and final in the bedroom they had shared for 49 years. After the funeral, after David had flown back to Phoenix, and the casseroles from neighbors had stopped appearing on the porch, Raymond had opened a new green notebook and started drawing. It was the only thing he knew how to do with grief. Chloe arrived Saturday at 9:15 with a box of Clavone's donuts and the specific expression she wore when she was trying not to have an opinion before she had gathered sufficient data. She was dressed practically jeans, a Carnegie Mellon pullover, her dark hair pulled back, and she set the donuts on the counter without ceremony and sat down across from the notebook. Raymond sat beside her rather than across from her. He wanted her to see what he saw. She read for a long time. She was not the kind of person who asked questions while she was still processing. Raymond drank his coffee and waited, and outside the October wind came off the river and shook the last leaves from the maple in the backyard. When she finally looked up, her expression was more complicated than he had expected. "This is real," she said. It was not entirely a compliment. It sounded like something she had hoped not to have to say. "I know it's real," Raymond said. The heat recovery loop on page 14. She tapped the notebook. "This efficiency rating. You're claiming 63% thermal conversion. Under optimal conditions. 58 in standard operating range. That's better than most combined cycle gas plants." "I know." She looked at him. "Grandpa, this is either genuinely brilliant or there's a flaw somewhere I'm not seeing yet. That's why I wanted you to look at it." She pulled the notebook toward her and turned back to page 7, starting again from the beginning. Raymond watched her the way he used to watch Dorothy read, with the particular pleasure of seeing someone he loved in full concentration. The world narrowed down to the text in front of them. After another 30 minutes, Chloe sat back and crossed her arms. "The pressure management on the secondary loop," she said. "You're relying on mechanical governors. Every modern system uses electronic regulation. Electronic regulation fails during power disruptions," Raymond said. "Which is exactly the scenario this system is designed to operate in. The mechanical governors are a feature." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay, I'll give you that." She tapped her finger on the table. "Has anyone else seen this?" "No. Are you planning to do something with it? Or is this just..." She stopped. "Just what? I don't know. Something to keep you busy." The words landed softly, but they landed. Raymond looked at his granddaughter and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. "There's a situation in Crestfield, Ohio," he said. "I've been following it. Hartwell Manufacturing. They're the last major employer in the county. They've been running on a patchwork electrical supply since the regional grid substation failed 8 months ago. They're paying emergency rates to a private supplier. It's killing them. The county has no money for infrastructure repair. State government has made promises and delivered nothing." He paused. "They need a solution. I have one." Chloe studied him. "You want to pitch this to a manufacturing company?" "To whoever will listen, Grandpa." Her voice had changed. Softer now, and more careful. "You know how this will look. You're 74. The system is steam-based. Nobody builds steam systems for industrial power anymore. They're going to. I know what they're going to do," Raymond said. "I've spent 50 years watching people laugh at things they didn't understand. It doesn't bother me the way you think it does." She looked at the notebook again. Something moved across her face, doubt and something else, older and harder to name. "I want to run the numbers myself," she said finally. "Give me 2 weeks." Raymond nodded. "Take 3. She took the notebook home in her canvas bag, tucked under her arm like something valuable, and Raymond stood on the porch and watched her car disappear around the corner of Bingham Street. The maple in the backyard dropped its last 3 leaves in the wind. He went inside and opened a new notebook. 3 weeks later, Chloe called him on a Tuesday evening. "I found 2 potential issues," she said without preamble, "both solvable. I also ran the core efficiency calculations independently, and you're right. Under the operating parameters you've defined, this system outperforms every current mid-scale industrial power solution by a significant margin. A beat. I don't fully understand why nobody has done this before. Because the people making energy decisions stopped learning from history about 30 years ago," Raymond said. "They decided steam was primitive. They stopped looking at it." "Well," another pause. "I think you should contact Hartwell Manufacturing." Raymond already had the phone number written in the back of his current notebook. He had written it there 6 weeks ago. "I'll write a formal proposal," he said. "Will you review it?" "Yes," Chloe said. And then quieter. "Grandpa, if this works, let's not talk about if," he said. "Let's talk about when." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "When?" After he hung up, Raymond sat at the kitchen table for a long time with his hands flat on the surface, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palms. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above him. Outside, Pittsburgh moved through its Tuesday evening, traffic on Carson Street. Someone's television loud through a shared wall, the distant sound of a barge on the river. He thought about Dorothy. He thought about the way she used to say, "Raymond, you are the most stubborn man God ever assembled," and the way it had never once sounded like criticism coming from her. Only like fact, only like love. He opened the notebook and started writing the proposal. Crestfield, Ohio sat 40 miles southeast of Columbus in the kind of flat, wide-open agricultural country that made the sky feel enormous and the towns feel small by contrast. It had been a modestly prosperous place once, not wealthy, not celebrated, but solid. In the way that Midwestern manufacturing towns are solid when the factory is running and the paychecks are arriving every 2 weeks. The kind of town where people go to the same barber for 20 years, and know the name of the guy who delivers their propane and measure time by high school football seasons. The Hartwell manufacturing plant sat at the eastern edge of town, a collection of long steel-sided buildings behind a chain-link fence that had been repaired in sections over the years until it looked like a quilt. The plant made precision-machined components for agricultural equipment, a business that was neither glamorous nor dying, sustained by steady demand and the particular expertise of a workforce that had been doing the same work for decades. At full operation, Hartwell employed 412 people. Since the electrical crisis, it employed 208. The rest had been furloughed, with promises of return that grew less convincing with each passing month. Raymond drove to Crestfield on a Thursday in early December, 3 hours from Pittsburgh on I-70, with his proposal printed and bound in a blue folder on the passenger seat and his notebook in his bag. He had worn his good gray suit, the one Dorothy had taken him to buy when David graduated college, and he had gotten it dry cleaned. He was aware that this was an unusual form of preparation for an engineering presentation. But he was also aware that he was walking into a room full of people who were going to make judgments about him before he opened his mouth, and he intended to give them as little material as possible. Hartwell's corporate office was in a separate building from the plant floor, a squat 2-story brick structure, near the front gate that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s named Gretchen, looked up when Raymond came through the door and gave him the particular expression that people give elderly men who arrive unannounced at business offices, a mixture of courtesy and preemptive management. "I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Mr. Stafford," Raymond said. "Raymond Ellsworth." "Of course." She typed something. "I'll let him know you're here." He sat in a chair beside a fake ficus and looked at the framed photographs on the wall, historical shots of the plant, black and white, workers in hard hats standing in front of equipment. He recognized the vintage of the machinery in one of the older photos, early 1970s, probably a Cincinnati Millicrone horizontal boring mill. He had worked on 3 of those in his career. Mitchell Stafford was Hartwell's director of operations, 47 years old, with the compact, controlled energy of a man who had spent 2 decades managing industrial facilities and had the posture to prove it. He came down the stairs with his hand already extended and his face already composed into the expression of someone being professionally courteous to a long shot. "Mr. Ellsworth, good to meet you. Likewise." Raymond shook his hand. Firm, brief. "We're set up in the conference room. My colleague Dennis Hargrove is joining us. He's our chief electrical systems consultant." The conference room was on the 2nd floor, with a window that looked out over the plant yard. Dennis Hargrove was already there, late 30s, rangy, with the kind of technical confidence that reads, from certain angles, as impatience. He was looking at his phone when Raymond came in, and he put it down and stood up in the way people do when they've been asked to attend a meeting they don't consider worth their time. "Dennis Hargrove," he said. "Raymond Ellsworth." They shook hands. Hargrove's grip was the kind that tests. They sat. Mitchell Stafford opened a yellow legal pad. Hargrove leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed in a pose that was almost textbook in its defensiveness. Raymond opened his blue folder and placed 3 copies of his proposal on the table. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "I'll keep the introduction brief because I think the work speaks for itself. I'm a retired mechanical engineer with 51 years of industrial systems experience, the last 12 as chief mechanical engineer for Consolidated Steel Partners. I've been following your situation with the electrical supply for several months. I believe I have a viable solution." Mitchell Stafford picked up the proposal and began leafing through it. Hargrove took his copy and looked at the first page. The room was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then Hargrove looked up. "Steam," he said. "Not a question, a verdict." "Hybrid steam turbine system," Raymond said. "High efficiency, closed loop, Mr. Ellsworth." Hargrove set the proposal down with a particular kind of precision that communicated everything. Steam power for industrial application hasn't been the primary generation method since, what, the 1950s? We're talking about a completely obsolete technology base. We're talking about thermodynamics, Raymond said, which doesn't become obsolete. The implementation does. Hargrove glanced at Stafford with an expression Raymond had seen before, the sideways look that men give each other when they want to communicate, without words, that the person they're dealing with is not worth taking seriously. Modern industrial power solutions are based on, I'm familiar with modern industrial power solutions, Raymond said. And something in his voice, calm, not cold but calibrated with precision, stopped Hargrove mid-sentence. I've worked with most of them. I'm also familiar with their failure rates under grid-independent operation, their capital costs at mid-scale deployment, and their maintenance requirements in facilities like this one. He tapped the proposal. If you look at page 6, I've included a comparative analysis. Stafford turned to page 6. Hargrove did not. Mr. Ellsworth, Stafford said, reading. These efficiency projections are conservative, Raymond said. I've built in a 15% operating margin below modeled performance. The real-world numbers should be better. Stafford looked at the proposal for a long moment. Raymond watched him read. He had learned over a long career to read the body language of men reading technical documents, the small signals of genuine engagement versus polite processing. Stafford was actually reading. Hargrove, meanwhile, had taken out his phone. What's the construction timeline? Stafford asked. 7 months to full operational capacity. The primary steam circuit can be functional within 4, which means partial power supply during construction. Capital cost, page 11. Estimated 1 to 2.4 million for the full system. Given your current emergency power costs, Raymond had done that math, you would reach cost recovery within 22 months at current industrial energy rates. Stafford looked at page 11. He made a note on his legal pad. Hargrove put his phone down. Where has this system been implemented? He asked. What's the operational track record? Raymond looked at him steadily. It hasn't been implemented. This is a new design. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Raymond had anticipated it. You're asking us, Hargrove said slowly, with the particular tone of a man who has found the thing he was looking for, to invest $4 million in a theoretical system designed by, he glanced at the front page of the proposal, a retired engineer, to solve an active industrial crisis using steam power. Yes, Raymond said. Hargrove actually laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of genuine disbelief, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether to allow it. He looked at Stafford again. Stafford did not laugh. He was looking at Raymond with an expression that was more thoughtful than Hargrove's and more tired. Mr. Ellsworth, he said, I appreciate you coming in. I do, and I'm not dismissing this out of hand. He closed the proposal with both hands carefully, the way you close something you mean to put in a drawer. But our board is not going to authorize capital investment in an unproven system, particularly right now when we're already in a financial pressure situation. We need a solution with a track record. Every solution had a first implementation, Raymond said. That's true, Stafford said, but not every first implementation was ours to absorb. Raymond sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his copy of the proposal, straightened it, and placed it back in his blue folder. I understand your position, he said. He stood up and extended his hand to Stafford. Thank you for your time. Stafford shook his hand. His grip was apologetic. Hargrove shook his hand, too. His was perfunctory. Raymond walked down the stairs and past the fake ficus and through the glass door of Hartwell's corporate office into the December cold of Crestfield, Ohio. The sky was the flat iron-gray color that Ohio's sky goes in winter, and the wind came across the fields with nothing to slow it down for miles. He sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. He had known the meeting would go this way. He had known it the moment he walked into the room and saw Hargrove's posture. He had spent enough years in industrial facilities to recognize the particular architecture of professional dismissal, the way it was built out of boredom and certainty in equal measure. It didn't defeat him. It never had. What it did, instead, was clarify. Every no was a coordinate. When you had enough of them, they formed a map that showed you where the yes was hiding. He started the engine and drove back toward Pittsburgh through the gray Ohio afternoon. And he thought about the proposal, and he thought about what needed to change. He called Chloe from the road. "How'd it go?" she asked, and from her tone he could tell she had been waiting for the call with more anxiety than she would admit. They said no. A pause. "I'm sorry. Don't be." The director, Stafford, he was actually reading it. "He's not the problem, the consultant. Hargrove. Dennis Hargrove." He decided what the answer was before I got there. Raymond passed a truck on the interstate, easing back into the right lane. "He's not the last word, though. Stafford has a board. You're thinking about going around Hargrove. I'm thinking about building something that Hargrove can't argue with." Raymond glanced at the gray fields rolling by outside. "Chloe, I want to build a prototype." The silence on the other end was different from Hargrove's silence. It carried weight and arithmetic. "A working prototype," she said. "A quarter-scale working model. Enough to demonstrate the core thermal loop in real operation. Enough to show efficiency measurements that aren't theoretical. That's," he heard her breath, "Grandpa, that's significant money. And space, and time." "I have time," he said. "I have the space, the garage. And I have some savings I've been not spending." "How much savings?" "Enough to start, if you'll help me with the build." Another long pause. Raymond waited. "On weekends," Chloe said finally. "And you have to let me flag anything that I think is unsafe before we build it." "No arguing." "Agreed." "And you have to eat lunch when we're working. Last time you were in the garage for 6 hours and didn't eat anything." Raymond almost smiled. "Agreed." "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's build it." Word got around Crestfield faster than Raymond had expected. Small towns have their own information infrastructure, a network built from diner conversations and parking lot observations and the particular efficiency of people who have known each other for decades. By the time Raymond drove back to Crestfield for a follow-up meeting with Stafford 2 weeks later, at Stafford's request, to his mild surprise, the story of the elderly Pittsburgh engineer with the steam proposal had already made its way through several layers of the local conversation. He discovered this when he stopped for coffee at a diner called Patsy's on Main Street. The woman at the counter, late 40s, strong forearms. The confident economy of movement of someone who has worked the same job for years, refilled his cup without asking and said, "You're the steam engine man." Raymond looked up. "News travels. In Crestfield it does." She leaned on the counter. "My husband works at Hartwell. Or he did before the furloughs." She looked at him with the direct appraisal of someone who doesn't have time for softness. "Is what you've got real?" "Yes," Raymond said. She looked at him for another moment. "Then I hope somebody up there listens to you," she said, and went to refill someone else's coffee. Her name, he would later learn, was Patricia Noel. Her husband's name was Gary Noel, and he had worked the precision machining floor at Hartwell for 19 years before the furloughs. Gary Noel would matter later. Raymond didn't know that yet. He finished his coffee and drove to Hartwell. Stafford met him alone this time. Hargrove was not in the building. "I owe you an apology," Stafford said, before Raymond had fully sat down. Dennis was dismissive in a way that wasn't appropriate. "He was honest," Raymond said. "I prefer honesty." Stafford looked at him. "He sent me a 3-page email after your meeting explaining why your system is technically non-viable. I forwarded it to 2 engineers I trust. One of them said he was mostly right. The other said he was mostly wrong." He paused. "I'm not a thermodynamics expert. I can't adjudicate it." "A working prototype would adjudicate it," Raymond said. "Are you building one?" "I'm starting to." Stafford was quiet for a moment. "How long?" 6 months, maybe 7. "We may not have 7 months." Raymond looked at him. "Then I'll need to be faster." Stafford looked back, and something shifted in his face, some calculation completing itself. "Mr. Ellsworth, I'm going to be direct with you. Our situation is worse than the public version. We have a board meeting in March. If we can't demonstrate a credible path to cost-stable power by then, there are people on the board who will move to close the facility entirely." March was 14 weeks away. Raymond felt the weight of that number settle across his shoulders. Not panic. He hadn't panicked since 1979, when a pressure vessel failure at a plant in Allentown had nearly taken off his left hand, and he had managed to keep 3 other workers calm while they waited for emergency services. Panic was a luxury, and Raymond Ellsworth had never been a man of luxuries. "I'll have something to show you before March," he said. "I can't promise full operational specs, but I can give you enough to make a decision." Stafford extended his hand. "That's all I'm asking." Raymond shook it. Driving back to Pittsburgh through the December dark, he called Chloe. "We have 14 weeks, he said. A pause. "Oh," she said, "can we do it?" A longer pause during which he could hear her doing exactly what he raised her, metaphorically, in the absence of a more engaged father, to do, running the problem through the machinery of her mind without letting fear contaminate the calculation. "We can do it," she said, "but we're going to need help." The garage behind the Bingham Street house was a long, narrow structure that Raymond had insulated and partially converted into a workshop over the years. It had a concrete floor with oil stains that mapped 30 years of projects, a workbench that ran the full length of the east wall, a lathe that he had bought secondhand in 2001 and maintained with the care most people give to living things, and a ceiling high enough to accommodate equipment of meaningful scale. He had cleared the center of the garage by the second week of December, moving stored materials and stacking them against the walls with the systematic efficiency of a man who has been organizing spaces his whole life. He had drawn new plans, smaller scale, but fully representative of the core thermal loop, and ordered the primary components: a stainless steel boiler shell, copper tubing of varying diameters, a set of turbine blades machined to his specifications by a job shop in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, valve assemblies, a mechanical governor system based on a Victorian-era design that he had updated with modern materials. The job shop in Bethlehem was run by a man named George McAllister, 62 years old, who had been machining specialty parts for industrial clients for 35 years, and who, when Raymond sent him the turbine blade specifications, called back within an hour. "These tolerances," McAllister said. "You're going to 0.003 inches on the blade root profile. Is that a problem?" Raymond asked. "Not for me," McAllister said. "I'm just asking because most people who specify tolerances like this don't get them right on the drawings. Yours are right." A pause. "Who trained you?" 50 years of making mistakes," Raymond said. McAllister laughed. "Best teacher there is. I'll have these to you in 3 weeks." Chloe began coming on Saturdays and, increasingly, Sundays. She had told her firm she was working on a personal project, which was true, and she had told the truth in the calibrated way that leaves out the parts that would generate questions. The first Saturday she arrived to find Raymond already in the garage at 7:30, with coffee in a thermos and the boiler shell positioned on a set of wooden horses in the center of the floor. She stood in the garage doorway looking at the space, the smell of metal and machine oil, the hiss of the shop heater in the corner, her grandfather in his worn canvas work jacket, and felt something she didn't immediately have words for. It was something like recognition, a sense of being in the right place in the way that has nothing to do with convenience. "Where do you want me?" she said. "Welding," Raymond said. "You're better than I am." This was true. Chloe had taken welding as an elective at Carnegie Mellon, one of those practical skills that the engineering curriculum officially included but many students treated as optional, and had discovered that she had a natural gift for it. The same spatial intuition and hand steadiness that made her excellent at technical drawing applied directly to the physical manipulation of joining metal. She put on a welding jacket and pulled the helmet down and went to work. They established a rhythm within the first hour that felt less like learning and more like remembering. Raymond measured and marked, checked and double-checked, narrated his thinking in the dry, precise manner of a man who had taught by doing for half a century. And Chloe worked the torch and asked questions and pushed back when she saw a different way. "The inlet flange on the secondary loop," she said, on the second Saturday, lifting her welding helmet and looking at Raymond across the boiler shell. "You've got it at a 90-degree angle to the flow axis. If you offset it by 15 degrees, you reduce the turbulence at the transition point." Raymond came around to look at it. He looked for a long time. "You're right," he said. He picked up a pencil and marked the change on his drawing. "Make the note. We adjust." This was the thing about Raymond Ellsworth that his granddaughter was still, at 26, absorbing. His ego, which was not small, was entirely disconnected from the question of whether he was right in any given instance. He cared about the system working. He cared about it with an intensity that made personal correctness irrelevant. She had never met anyone else who operated that way. Her own father, David, was constitutionally unable to acknowledge error. Her bosses at the consulting firm were good engineers who, nonetheless, protected their positions with the low-level dishonesty of professionals who had learned that the institution rewarded confidence over accuracy. Raymond was something different. Raymond was someone for whom the work was simply too important to lie about. She thought about that on the drive home, in the dark January evenings. And she thought about what it meant to have inherited some of that from him, while also having learned from the world outside the garage how much it cost. The prototype took shape through January and into February, component by component, weld by weld, connection by connection. Raymond documented every stage in his notebooks, 3 of them filled by mid-February, with the same precision he had brought to 50 years of industrial work. The documentation was partly engineering record and partly something else, a form of faith, a commitment to the reality of the thing even before it existed. They encountered problems. The mechanical governor had a resonance issue at low RPM that caused oscillation in the valve timing. A problem Raymond diagnosed by watching the system run for 4 hours without speaking, only observing, until the pattern revealed itself. The fix required a change to the flyball weight distribution that took a full weekend to engineer and implement. The heat exchanger on the recovery loop ran hot on one side due to an asymmetry in the flow distribution that neither Raymond nor Chloe had caught in the design phase. Chloe found it at 2 in the morning on a Sunday, staring at the temperature data from the test run, and called Raymond, not caring that it was 2 in the morning because she knew he would be awake. He was awake. "The inlet manifold," she said. "The branching ratio is off. We need to go back in." "I see it," he said. He had been looking at the same data on his laptop. "We modify the manifold branches. I can have the revised calculations to you by morning." "I'll do them," she said. "Go to sleep." He didn't go to sleep, but he let her have the calculations. The revision required 2 additional weeks. It moved their timeline to the edge. It was in the 3rd week of February that the trouble came from outside. Raymond had not been publicizing the project. But Crestfield was small, and word moved in small towns the way water moves in flat country, quietly, covering ground. Someone at Hartwell had mentioned the Pittsburgh engineer and his garage prototype to someone who mentioned it to a reporter at the Crestfield Courier-Register, a local paper that covered the Hartwell situation with the persistent attention of a publication whose readership was directly affected. The Courier-Register ran a story. It was not unkind, but it was not neutral either. The headline read, "Retired engineer builds steam-powered solution in Pittsburgh garage, but will anyone listen?" The story quoted Hargrove, who had been contacted for comment. His quote was measured but precise. "Steam technology for industrial power generation has fundamental efficiency limitations that have been well documented for decades. While I respect Mr. Ellsworth's experience, the engineering community has moved beyond steam for very good reasons. I would not recommend any industrial facility to take its future on an unproven, anachronistic system. The story also quoted Patricia Noel, who had apparently been found by the reporter at Patsy's Diner on Main Street, and who had said, "Without hedging, my husband worked that plant for 19 years. If Mr. Ellsworth says he can fix the power problem, I believe him. I've seen enough suits with their charts come in and make it worse." Raymond read the story on a Wednesday morning. He read it twice. Then he called Chloe. "You've seen it," she said before he could speak. "Yes," Hargroves quote. "Yes, are you okay?" Raymond looked out his kitchen window at the February sky over Pittsburgh, white and flat and dense with coming snow. "Get me Hargroves' professional history," he said. "His publications, his past projects, any systems he's designed or consulted on. I want to know his record." "Grandpa, not for an attack," he said, "for preparation. I want to understand what he knows and what he doesn't. If we're going to stand in front of a board and present this system, I need to know the specific objections before they arrive." A pause. "Okay," Chloe said. "I'll pull it together." And Chloe, "Yeah?" "The prototype needs to run clean for 72 consecutive hours before we go back to Crestfield. No anomalies. Full output range. Can we do that by the first week of March?" A long silence. Raymond could hear her breathing. "Yes," she said. "We can do that." The prototype ran for its first full test cycle on February 28th, a Thursday evening, in the Bingham Street garage, with the snow coming down outside and the shop heater working hard against the cold. Raymond had invited 2 people to witness it. One was Chloe, who was technically not a witness so much as a co-creator, but who stood back on the far side of the garage with her arms crossed and her face carefully composed. The other was a man named Frank DeLuca, 68, who had been Raymond's closest colleague at Consolidated Steel Partners for 15 years, and who was, in Raymond's estimation, the finest practical thermodynamics engineer he had ever worked alongside. Frank had driven down from his retirement home in Butler County on 2 hours' notice and was standing with his coffee mug, looking at the prototype with an expression that Raymond recognized as the engineering version of awe, analytical and almost unwilling. "All right," Frank said when Raymond opened the steam valve and the system came to pressure. "All right." The prototype was not beautiful. It was built for function, a dense assembly of copper and steel and brass fittings, with the boiler shell at the center and the turbine housing connected by the primary steam line. The recovery loop running back around in the closed circuit that was the heart of the design's efficiency. Pressure gauges, temperature sensors, the mechanical governor, its flyballs spinning in their small orbit at the top of the assembly. An electrical output measurement connected to a simple test load, 600 watts of resistance heating, enough to demonstrate meaningful power generation at the prototype scale. The turbine came up to speed over the first 4 minutes. The output gauge climbed. Raymond watched the mechanical governor maintain the RPM within the parameters he had set, the little flyballs tracing their ancient, elegant arc, doing what they had been designed to do since James Watt invented them in 1788, which was translate speed into control with pure mechanical logic. At 6 minutes, the system reached steady-state operation. The output gauge read 640 watts, 12.8% above the test load, efficiency within the calculated range. Frank DeLuca set down his coffee mug. "Raymond," he said. "This is real, I know," Raymond said. Chloe said nothing. She was looking at the output gauge with an expression that took Raymond a moment to identify. Then he realized she was crying, very quietly, not making it into anything, just standing there with tears on her face and her arms still crossed, watching the gauge. He didn't mention it. He looked back at the prototype and let her have the moment. The 72-hour test run began the following Sunday. Raymond and Chloe ran it in shifts, Chloe through the days, Raymond through the nights, with Frank DeLuca serving as a third observer for a stretch on Monday. They logged data every 30 minutes. Output, temperature, pressure, valve timing, efficiency ratio, fuel consumption. At hour 19, the governor showed a minor oscillation. Raymond adjusted the flyball tension by a quarter turn. The oscillation ceased. At hour 41, a pipe fitting on the secondary loop showed a micro leak, a small bead of moisture at a joint. Chloe caught it on her check at 2:15 in the morning, called Raymond, and they repaired it together in 40 minutes. The repair held. At hour 72, Raymond stood in front of the prototype and looked at the data logs. 72 hours of continuous operation. Average thermal efficiency, 57.4%. Average electrical output, 623 watts against a 600-watt test load. No significant degradation of performance over the run period. Fuel consumption within 4% of projected figures. He wrote the final numbers in his notebook. Then he called Mitchell Stafford. "I'll be in Crestfield on Thursday," he said. "I'd like to present to your board." A pause. "Can you bring the system?" "I'll bring data and documentation. The prototype is too large to transport without disassembly." Another pause. Longer. "Mr. Ellsworth, the board meeting is Friday. Some of these people are—" Stafford chose his words carefully. "They're not inclined to take risks." "I know," Raymond said. "Let me worry about the board." He drove to Crestfield on Thursday in Frank DeLucas's pickup truck because the blue folder had become a larger package, bound documentation. Printed data logs from the 72-hour run, scaled engineering drawings. A cost-benefit analysis that he and Chloe had prepared over the previous 10 days. And a video on a laptop showing 40 minutes of the prototype in continuous operation. Chloe rode with him. She had requested 2 days off from her firm for a personal matter and had not elaborated, and she sat in the passenger seat with her laptop open and her earbuds in for most of the drive, reviewing her notes, which Raymond found both admirable and slightly anxious-making. They stopped at Patsy's Diner on Main Street. Patricia Noel was working. She came around the counter when she saw Raymond and Chloe come in, and she shook Raymond's hand with both of hers. "My husband is at the meeting tomorrow," she said, along with about 60 others from the plant. "They're going to be there." Raymond looked at her. "The board meeting is internal. They'll be outside," she said. "Gary organized it just to be there." She paused. "People need to feel like they're doing something, you understand?" Raymond understood. They ate lunch. Chloe had the chicken soup. Raymond had the turkey sandwich and ate all of it because he had promised. The board meeting was not in the Hartwell office building. It was in the Crestfield Community Center, a larger space, commandeered for the occasion because the full board required it. When Raymond arrived on Friday morning, there were 9 board members seated at a long table, along with Mitchell Stafford, Dennis Hargrove, the company's chief financial officer, a woman named Beverly Strand, late 50s, with the precise watchfulness of someone whose job is to see through presentations, and 2 outside engineers who had been brought in by Hargrove. Raymond took one look at the outside engineers and revised his approach and the time it took to cross the room. They were both academic university affiliations, he could tell, from the conservative professional dress and the way they were reviewing documents. With the slight remove of people who evaluate rather than build. Hargrove had brought reinforcements. Good, Raymond thought. I've always done better with a harder room. Outside the community center, through the windows, he could see the gathering. 60 people, maybe more now, standing in the February cold in the parking lot. Some of them held handwritten signs. He saw Gary Noel, a broad man in a Hartwell jacket, mid-40s, standing at the front of the group with his hands in his pockets, looking at the building. Raymond set up his materials. Chloe sat to his left, laptop open, data files queued. Hargrove was watching him from across the table with an expression that had changed since December, still skeptical, but no longer dismissive. The newspaper article had done something. The rumor of the prototype had done something more. Beverly Strand opened the meeting. "Mr. Ellsworth, you have 45 minutes. The floor is yours." Raymond stood. "Thank you," he said. "I'll start with the 72-hour test run data, because I think that's what this room needs to see first." He nodded to Chloe, who turned the laptop to face the table. The video began. The prototype in operation, the gauges in frame, the timestamp in the corner, the output measurements visible. Uncut footage, no narration. 60 seconds of watching a steam turbine system run at steady state, with the numbers visible. The room was very quiet. This system, Raymond said, produced an average thermal efficiency of 57.4% over 72 continuous hours of operation. For comparison, the national average for natural gas simple cycle generation is approximately 35%. For the emergency diesel supply you're currently using, he looked at Beverly Strand, who he had confirmed was the one managing the power contracts you're operating at between 28 and 32%, depending on load conditions. He could see Strand doing arithmetic. The system scaled to Hartwell's operational requirements would produce sufficient electrical power for full plant operation with approximately 40% reduction in energy cost compared to your current emergency supply. The capital payback period at current energy rates is 20 to 24 months. He paused. "I'm happy to walk through the engineering details in whatever depth this room requires, but I wanted you to see the numbers first because the numbers are what this decision is about." One of Hargrove's outside engineers, a man named Dr. Paul Whitaker, according to the nameplate, raised his hand. The efficiency figure, 57.4%. "Can you speak to the fuel input quality used in the test run?" "Grade O wood pellets, standard combustion moisture content," Raymond said. "Same grade available from 3 suppliers within 50 miles of Crestfield at current commodity pricing." "And scaling losses?" Whitaker continued. "The prototype is a fraction of the operational scale. Efficiency typically degrades at scale." "Typically," Raymond agreed, "in systems where the primary constraint is combustion uniformity. In a closed-loop steam circuit, efficiency can actually improve at scale due to reduced surface-to-volume ratio in the boiler and more favorable pressure maintenance in the main circuit." He turned to page 9 of his documentation. "I've modeled this explicitly. Conservative estimate for the full-scale system is 54 to 56% efficiency, accounting for scaling losses." Whitaker made a note. He was genuinely engaging with it, Raymond could see. Whatever Hargrove had briefed him on, he was doing his own evaluation now. Hargrove himself had been quiet since the meeting began. He was reading the documentation in a way that was different from December, focused, without the posture of dismissal. Raymond watched him from the corner of his eye. At the 20-minute mark, Beverly Strand asked about construction disruption to ongoing operations. At the 30-minute mark, Whitaker's colleague, a doctor, Sandra Marsh, asked about maintenance requirements and spare parts availability for a mechanical governor system. It was a sharp question, the most technically sophisticated of the session, and Raymond answered it at length, citing the specific components, their sources, their standard service intervals, and the fact that mechanical governors had a documented operational life, under proper maintenance, of decades. "Modern electronic control systems," he said without emphasis, "have documented failure rates under grid-independent conditions that are significantly higher than mechanical systems of equivalent design. For a facility in your situation, operating outside stable grid supply, the reliability argument strongly favors the mechanical approach." Sandra Marsh nodded slowly, but she made a note. At minute 38, Dennis Hargrove spoke for the first time. "Mr. Ellsworth." His voice was different from December, more careful, more honest. "I want to ask about the transition period. If the board authorizes this project, what does the overlap look like between your system coming online and the current emergency supply?" Raymond looked at him. He looked at a man who is doing what good engineers are supposed to do, and usually don't, revising his position in response to evidence. "A parallel operation period of 4 to 6 weeks, Raymond said. The steam circuit reaches initial pressure capacity at approximately the 4-month construction mark. During the overlap period, both systems run simultaneously, and the steam system is load tested under real operating conditions before the emergency supply is terminated. Hargrove nodded, made a note. Raymond finished at minute 43. Beverly Strand thanked him. The board broke for 15 minutes. Raymond and Chloe sat at the back of the community center. Chloe poured coffee from the thermos she had brought. Her hands were steady. "How do you think it went?" she asked. "Sandra Marsh is a yes," Raymond said quietly. "Whitaker is a probable yes. Strand is running the math and she's good at it, which means the math will get there." He picked up his coffee. "Hargrove is the variable." Chloe looked at him. "You think Hargrove might support it?" "I think Hargrove is an engineer," Raymond said. "Not all engineers are brave enough to change their position publicly, but some are." He paused. "We'll see." Outside the windows in the parking lot, the people from Hartwell were still there, still standing in the cold. Gary Noel, hands in his pockets, looking at the community center building with the particular patience of someone who has learned that the things that matter most are decided in rooms you're not allowed into. The board meeting reconvened. Beverly Strand spoke first. "We have some additional questions," she said, "and then we'll need to deliberate." She looked at Raymond. "Mr. Ellsworth, does your proposal include your ongoing involvement in the installation and commissioning process?" "Yes," Raymond said. "I would serve as technical lead for the full construction and commissioning phase. My granddaughter, Chloe Ellsworth, who is a licensed mechanical engineer, would serve as co-lead." Strand made a note. The additional questions ran for another 20 minutes. At one point, one of the board members, an older man named Roger Keene, who had been quiet through the entire presentation, looked at Raymond over his reading glasses and said, "Mr. Ellsworth, you're 74 years old. What's your contingency if your health limits your involvement mid-project?" The room went slightly still. Raymond looked at Keene without any particular change of expression. "Mr. Keene, I've documented this system with sufficient completeness that any competent mechanical engineer could complete the installation from my notes. My co-lead has full technical knowledge of every component and system, and I've been in good health for 74 years without notable interruption, which I attribute to not sitting at desks and to my late wife's cooking." He paused. "I expect to be there at the commissioning." Keene actually smiled. "Fair enough," he said. Beverly Strand called the break for deliberation. Hargrove approached Raymond during the break. He crossed the room without particular hurry, with the slightly effortful bearing of a man navigating something uncomfortable. He stopped in front of Raymond and was quiet for a moment. "The mechanical governor solution," he said, "for grid-independent operation. I didn't think about it from that angle." He paused. "I should have." Raymond looked at him. "You looked at it the way most people look at steam. You assumed the conclusion before you ran the analysis." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I did." He extended his hand. "I'm going to recommend approval." Raymond shook his hand. "I appreciate it," Raymond said. "Don't thank me," Hargrove said. "Thank whoever taught you that a 72-hour data run is worth more than 100 meetings." He almost smiled. "I'll remember that." The board voted at 2:17 in the afternoon. 6 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 opposed, Roger Keene, which surprised Raymond until Mitchell Stafford quietly told him that. Keene had voted against every major capital expenditure since 2019 on principle. He also voted no on the parking lot repaving. Stafford said, "Don't take it personally." Raymond did not take it personally. He walked out of the community center into the February cold, and Gary Noel was the first person he saw standing at the front of the group in the parking lot watching the door. Raymond gave a single nod. Noel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he opened them and turned to the group around him and said something Raymond couldn't hear. But he could hear the sound that went through the crowd, not a cheer exactly, more like a collective exhale. The sound of 60 people releasing something they had been holding for a long time. Chloe came out beside Raymond and stood with her shoulder against his arm. She was very still. "March," she said quietly. "March," he agreed. Behind them, through the community center windows, the board was still in session, reviewing the authorization paperwork that Beverly Strand had prepared in advance. Because Beverly Strand was the kind of person who prepared paperwork in advance of decisions she considered likely. The Hartwell plant, half a mile away, sat under the Ohio winter sky, its steel-sided buildings and chain-link fence and the silent machinery waiting inside it. 412 jobs that had become 208, waiting to become 412 again. Raymond Ellsworth looked at it from the parking lot. He had looked at a lot of industrial buildings in his life, had walked their floors and understood their machinery and diagnosed their failures, and he had never once looked at one without thinking about the people inside it. The machines were the work, the people were the reason. He turned up his collar against the cold and walked to his car. Construction began on March 14th. Raymond moved to Crestfield for the duration. He rented a room from a widow named Eunice Ballard on Maple Avenue, a clean, quiet room with a good reading lamp and a kitchen where Eunice left coffee made in the mornings and asked no questions beyond whether he needed extra blankets. He paid his rent on time and kept the room tidy and was, by all accounts, the most self-sufficient tenant Eunice had accommodated in 20 years of taking in boarders. Chloe drove out from Pittsburgh every Monday morning and drove back every Friday evening. She had negotiated a 4-day remote work arrangement with her firm for the duration of the project, a negotiation that had required her to be more forthcoming about what she was actually doing than she had originally planned. Her manager, a careful, decent man named Stuart Orr, had listened to her describe the project and then said slowly, "Your grandfather designed this." And Chloe had said yes, and Stuart had said, "And you verified the thermodynamics?" And she had said yes again, and Stuart had looked at his desk for a moment and then said, "Take the Mondays. Keep up with your client reports." She had thanked him and left before he could change his mind. The construction site was the eastern end of the Hartwell plant yard, a cleared section of concrete pad adjacent to the main power intake, selected for its proximity to both the fuel receiving area and the primary distribution equipment. Hartwell's facilities manager, a laconic veteran named Carl Briggs, had prepared the site with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing industrial construction management for 30 years and found most engineers either insufficiently practical or insufficiently precise. He found Raymond both within about 4 hours, and after that treated him with the specific respect that competent people extend to other competent people without ceremony. "What's your first priority?" Briggs asked on the first morning. "Boiler foundation," Raymond said. "Everything else depends on the load distribution. We get the foundation wrong, and we get everything wrong." Briggs nodded. "Concrete crew is here at 7 tomorrow." "Good." They shook hands. That was the full extent of their formal introduction. The workforce assembled for the project was small by industrial construction standards, 12 people at peak, but selected with the particular care that Raymond applied to every component of every system he had ever built. He had learned early in his career that a project of this nature lives or dies not in the design phase but in the execution phase, in the hands of the people who are actually threading pipe and tightening flanges and making the 1,000 small decisions that never appear in engineering drawings. Carl Briggs provided 4 of Hartwell's own maintenance staff, people who knew the facility, who had lived through the electrical crisis, who had personal stakes in the outcome. They worked with a particular focus that Raymond had seen before, in plants where the workers understood that the project in front of them was not abstract. Frank DeLuca drove down from Butler County for the first 2 weeks and stayed in a motel on Route 40. His official role was technical observer. His actual role was the thing it had always been, the other voice, the second set of eyes. The person Raymond could argue with at 6 in the morning when a decision needed pressure testing, before it became concrete. Patricia Noel brought food. This was not something Raymond had anticipated or requested, but it became, within the first week, a feature of the construction site. A round blue cooler arriving at 10:30 in the morning containing sandwiches and thermoses of coffee, and, on Fridays, something baked. Patricia had not been asked. She had simply appeared with the cooler on the third day and set it by the site trailer and said, "Thought you could use it," and Raymond had looked at her and said thank you, and she had nodded and gone back to work at Patsy's. After that, it was simply part of the schedule. Gary Noel was not on Hartwell's construction crew. He was on furlough, had been for 7 months. But he showed up on the second Saturday in his Hartwell jacket and his work boots, and found Raymond at the foundation. "I'm not here officially," he said, "just to look." Raymond looked at him. At the 19 years in his face, the careful pride of a man who had defined himself by his work and then been separated from it. "Can you read a schematic?" Raymond asked. Noel looked slightly surprised. "I spent 15 years on the precision machining floor." "Yes, sir." "Then you're not just here to look," Raymond said, and handed him the site drawing. "Tell me if the primary steamline routing makes sense to you from a maintenance access standpoint. You know this plant better than I do." Noel took the drawing. He looked at it for a long time, turning it, reading it the way a man reads something he's been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. "This bend here," he said, pointing. "If you route it 6 inches higher, you can get to the flange from the main floor without a ladder." Raymond looked where he was pointing. He considered it. "You're right," he said, "mark it." Noel picked up a pencil and marked it. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By week 4 he was there every day, and nobody questioned it, because the work required people who cared about it, and Noel cared about it in the same cellular way that Raymond did. Not because it was his job, but because the outcome was real to him in a way that transcended any formal relationship to the project. Carl Briggs processed the paperwork to bring him on officially in week 5. Hartwell's HR department approved it as a temporary construction assignment, which meant Noel's furlough became employment again. And the particular weight he had been carrying for 7 months shifted to something different. Still heavy, but productive, purposeful weight. Raymond didn't make anything of it. He just watched Noel work, and noted what he already knew, that the difference between a man going through the motions and a man building something he needs was visible in every movement, every measurement, every decision. The construction proceeded on schedule through March and into April, with the particular momentum that accumulates when a project is well designed and well led, and when the people doing the work understand what it's for. There were problems. There are always problems. A delivery of copper tubing arrived with 3 sections out of tolerance, a manufacturing error that Raymond caught on inspection before installation, saving 2 days of potential rework. A vibration issue in the turbine mounting became apparent during initial dry run testing in week 7, tracing to a resonance between the turbine speed and a natural frequency in the steel support frame. Raymond and Chloe worked through the night on that one, calculating the stiffener configuration that would shift the frame's natural frequency outside the operating range. And Carl Briggs had the stiffeners welded in place by 8 the following morning. There was also the matter of Dennis Hargrove. Hargrove had been present at the Hartwell site on 4 occasions since construction began. Brief visits, professional and observational, which Raymond had treated with the same courtesy he would extend to any engineer doing due diligence on a project they had been associated with. On his 4th visit in the 5th week of construction, Hargrove stood at the edge of the primary circuit installation and watched Carl Briggs's crew work for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to Raymond, who was standing nearby reviewing a drawing. "I've been looking at your heat recovery loop design," Hargrove said, "in my own time." He paused. "There's a paper from 2019, a German research group, working on biomass-fired industrial steam systems. They got 259.2% thermal efficiency in a full-scale test." Raymond looked up from the drawing. "Leibniz Institute," he said. "I read it." Hargrove blinked. "You read it. It came out in a German engineering journal." I had it translated. Raymond looked back at his drawing. Their closed-loop configuration was different from mine. Different fuel input system. Their efficiency number is real, but it's not directly comparable. My design has better recovery on the low-pressure exhaust side. A beat of silence. I know, Hargrove said. I figured that out. He paused again, in the way of a man choosing his next words with care. I think your exhaust recovery approach might actually be publishable. The configuration is novel. Raymond looked at him. You're welcome to co-author something, if you want, when this is running. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face, surprise, or something older and less nameable. Yeah, he said, I'd like that. They stood together at the edge of the construction site, the two engineers watching other people build something. And Raymond thought that this was one of the things he had always loved about the work. The way it occasionally broke through the armor that people built around themselves and reminded them that what they shared was more important than what divided them. The love of systems that were honest, the pleasure of a thing that worked. The primary steam circuit reached initial operational pressure on May 3rd, a Monday, at 11:47 in the morning. Raymond was at the pressure gauge. Chloe was at the turbine monitoring station. Carl Briggs was at the fuel input. Gary Noel was at the main valve because Raymond had asked him to be. Ready, Raymond said. Ready, Chloe confirmed. Fuel input stable, Briggs said. Noel had his hand on the main valve. He looked at Raymond across the space of the construction site, across the new pipework and the steel framework, and the months of work compressed into this moment. Open it, Raymond said. Noel opened the valve. The sound of steam entering the primary circuit is not the sound most people imagine. It is not a dramatic roar. It is a rising hiss, purposeful and pressured, that grows from almost nothing to a steady, continuous voice as the system comes to life. It is the sound of thermodynamics becoming real, of heat becoming work, of a principle that has been true for 300 years, expressing itself again in a new configuration. The turbine came up to speed in the first 4 minutes. The frequency of the generator matched the grid standard in the 6th minute, when the synchronization panel showed the green light that indicated the system was producing power at the correct frequency and phase. At minute 8, the output meter read 420 kilowatts. At minute 12, 540 kilowatts. The load test, running the primary production equipment of the Hartwell plant on the new system for the first time, reached its first stable plateau at 680 kilowatts, within 3% of the design specification. The old power supply ran in parallel, exactly as Raymond had planned, providing backup while the new system proved itself. But the numbers were clear from the first hour. Chloe stood at her monitoring station with her laptop open and her data running, and she did not cry this time. She was past that. She was in the pure, clean space of confirmed calculation, the place where the world behaves exactly as the mathematics said it would, and the satisfaction of it is unlike anything else in human experience. She looked across the site at her grandfather. He was writing in his notebook. Even now, even at the moment of it. He was recording the numbers. She smiled at him. He looked up, saw the smile, and gave her one small nod, the nod that said, "This is what I knew it would be," and went back to writing. The parallel operation period ran for 5 weeks. In that time, the steam system accumulated 840 hours of operational data. Average thermal efficiency, 56.8%. Average output, 672 kilowatts. Fuel costs per kilowatt hour, significantly below the emergency supply contract. 0 unplanned shutdowns. Beverly Strand reviewed the operational data at the 4-week mark and sent Raymond a 2-line email that read, "Mr. Ellsworth, the cost projections are tracking ahead of your conservative estimate. We are terminating the emergency supply contract at the end of the parallel period. Thank you." Raymond read the email at his kitchen table on Maple Avenue, in Eunice Ballard's house, under the particular quality of morning light that came through the east-facing window in late May. He read it twice. Then he called Chloe. She picked up on the first ring. "I got it too," she said. He could hear in her voice all the things she wasn't saying, and he didn't need her to say them. He had his own versions of all the same things. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Raymond looked out the window at the Crestfield street. Ordinary, mid-American, the kind of street that exists in hundreds of towns across Ohio, unremarkable and irreplaceable. A man was walking a dog. A woman was backing a car out of a driveway. The trees were fully leafed out now, the gray winter entirely gone. "Like I have work to do," he said. Chloe laughed, a real laugh, sudden and warm. "Of course you do. The documentation for the full-scale system needs to be completed. Hargrove wants to write the paper. There are 2 other towns in eastern Ohio with similar grid situations. I've been looking at them, and I want to expand the biomass fuel analysis." "Grandpa, what? Can you just, for 1 minute, let it be done? Let it be good?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the man with the dog stopped on the sidewalk to let the dog investigate something at the base of a telephone pole. The ordinary world proceeding. He thought about Dorothy. He thought about the way she used to put her hand on his arm when he was already mentally 3 steps ahead of whatever had just been accomplished. The gentle, certain pressure of her hand that said, "Be here. This moment is the one you worked for. Be in it." He was 74 years old. He had worked for 51 years. He had watched industries rise and fall around him, and had outlasted the certainties of people who thought they knew what was possible, and had built something in a garage in Pittsburgh that was now running a factory in Ohio, and would keep running it for years after he was gone. "1 minute," he said. "1 minute," Chloe agreed. They stayed on the phone together in silence for a minute, a grandfather and his granddaughter, 100 miles apart, both present to the same moment, and then Raymond said gently, "All right, now let's talk about the biomass analysis." And Chloe laughed again, and they got to work. The Hartwell plant reopened its furloughed positions in June. 204 workers returned to the floor in a hiring process. That took 3 weeks. Gary Noel went back to precision machining, his floor, his machines, his 19 years of knowledge exactly where he had left them. And on his first morning back, he stopped at the eastern yard on his way in and looked at the steam system running in the early light, the pressure gauge visible through the housing window, the governor spinning its quiet arc. And he stood there for a minute, the way you stand at something that gave you back what you thought you'd lost. He didn't say anything to anyone about it. Some things don't need to be said. The paper that Raymond and Dennis Hargrove co-authored was submitted to the Journal of Engineering for Industry in September. Its title was Closed-Loop Biomass Steam Turbine Systems for Grid-Independent Industrial Power, Design Principles, Operational Data, and Thermal Efficiency Analysis. It was peer-reviewed, revised once, and accepted for publication in December. In the acknowledgments section, Hargrove had written a line that had not been in the original draft. He had added it in the revision, and Raymond had read it and not commented on it because it didn't require comment. The authors wished to acknowledge that the core design described in this paper originated with Raymond Ellsworth, whose willingness to be wrong and to prove that he wasn't is the model this work aspires to. Raymond read that line in his kitchen on Bingham Street under Dorothy's light, and he sat with it for a while. The Pittsburgh fall was outside the window, the maples burning their annual red and gold, the river somewhere behind the houses in its permanent course. He opened a new notebook. He had 2 more towns to think about. The story of Raymond Ellsworth moved through Crestfield and then moved further, the way stories move when they are made of something real. It appeared in the Columbus Dispatch in a piece about rural industrial revitalization. It was referenced in an energy policy discussion in Columbus that Raymond did not attend but read about. A graduate student at Ohio State named Marcus Finley contacted Chloe to ask whether Raymond would be willing to speak at an engineering seminar about the design process, the actual design process, not the cleaned-up retrospective version, but the 11 months of notebook pages, the garage in winter, the 72-hour test run. Raymond said yes. He drove to Columbus on a Tuesday in November, stood in front of 60 engineering students in a lecture hall, and talked for 90 minutes without notes. He talked about thermodynamics as a language that doesn't change. He talked about the difference between innovation and fashion, about the way industries accumulate assumptions over time until the assumptions calcify into convictions, and the convictions prevent people from seeing what's actually in front of them. He talked about his late wife's kitchen light and the way grief and work were not as different as people thought. He talked about a 26-year-old engineer who could weld better than he could, and who had saved the heat recovery loop one night at 2 in the morning. He talked about Gary Noel standing at the main valve with his hand ready. The room was very quiet. Not the quiet of boredom, the other kind. The kind that happens when 60 people are listening with everything they have. When he finished, he gathered his things, and a student in the front row, a young woman, maybe 22, with the particular focused seriousness of someone who has decided to take her field seriously, raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Ellsworth, was there ever a moment when you thought you were wrong, that the system wouldn't work?" Raymond looked at her. He considered giving the confident answer, the one that made a better story. "Yes," he said instead. Hour 41 of the 72-hour test, we found a micro leak in the secondary loop at 2 in the morning. And while we were fixing it, I sat down on the garage floor for about 10 minutes and I thought, maybe they were right. Maybe I'm too old to know the difference between a real idea and one I'm too attached to see clearly. The room was very quiet. "What changed?" she asked. "My granddaughter fixed the leak," Raymond said, "and the system ran clean for the next 31 hours. And I remembered something my wife used to say, that the difference between stubbornness and faith is whether you're right." He paused. "I was right. But I didn't know that at 2 in the morning. I just knew I wasn't ready to stop yet." He picked up his bag. "That's usually enough," he said. "Not knowing you're right, just not being ready to stop." In December, Raymond drove back to Pittsburgh from Crestfield for the last time as a resident of Eunice Ballard's guest room. The Hartwell project was complete. The system was fully commissioned. The documentation was filed. The plant was running. The paper was in peer review. His work in Crestfield was done. Eunice walked him to his car with the particular ease of someone who had stopped treating him as a tenant somewhere around week 3, and started treating him as something more like a permanent feature of the house, not a family member exactly, but a presence that had weight and meaning. "You'll come back through," she said. It was not a question. "I'll come through," Raymond said. "I have business in the area." She nodded. She already knew about the other towns. He drove back to Pittsburgh through the December countryside, through the familiar Ohio flatlands, and then the river valleys of western Pennsylvania, the land changing character the way it always did on that drive, opening and closing, the sky alternately enormous and intimate. He drove with the radio off and his hands easy on the wheel and his mind already in the next notebook. He pulled onto Bingham Street as the streetlights were coming on. He carried his bag inside and set it down in the kitchen and stood at the window for a moment, the river invisible in the dark, the neighborhood settling into its evening sounds, the kitchen light buzzing faintly overhead. Dorothy's light. He put his hand up and touched the shade, the fixture she had chosen at the hardware store in 1987, that he had never once considered replacing, because some things are not about function, some things are about what they mean. Some things are about the person who chose them and the life that was built in the light they made. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the shade. Then he sat down at the table, opened his notebook to the first clean page, and began to draw. In the 2 years that followed, Raymond Ellsworth designed hybrid steam systems for 2 additional Ohio communities, Milford Falls and Hendricks County, both in partnership with Chloe. Both constructed under the supervision of Carl Briggs, who had become, without any formal arrangement, the project manager Raymond called when he needed someone who could build what he designed. Hargrove's paper received 412 citations within 18 months of publication. A research grant was awarded to Ohio State for further development of closed-loop biomass steam technology. Marcus Finley's graduate thesis was based on the Crestfield installation. Gary Noel was promoted to floor supervisor at Hartwell in the spring following the plant's full reopening. He declined an offer to move to a management position in Columbus. He said he preferred to stay where his work was. Patricia Noel continued to run Patsy's Diner on Main Street. The blue cooler stayed in the corner booth as a kind of informal civic monument, which was not something anyone decided officially but which everyone understood. Chloe Ellsworth left her consulting firm in the fall and established her own engineering practice, specializing in sustainable industrial power systems. Her first client was a manufacturing facility in rural Kentucky. Her second was in upstate New York. She kept the green notebook Raymond had given her, the one with her modifications to the heat recovery loop in her own handwriting, on her desk where it remained. Raymond Ellsworth continued to work. He was, in his own estimation, only getting started.